Okay, so I'm going to go on and show you the comments from the two different observers and think a little bit about the underlying approaches and theories that inform these kinds of comments. So observer one's comments felt that some of the language in the task questions was challenging for lower level students, example being cohesive devices, and that eliciting the meaning of this language might have been helpful. Although the slides with the highlighted text presented after the group discussion very clearly illustrated the use of cohesive devices. However, some rather challenging meta-language was used. An example of that is process, with Newton as the agent and subject position. It was also unclear whether all students understood. So having the highlighted text on a handout with simpler language might have made the task more accessible to lower levels. So that was observer one's comment. Observer two said the lesson aims were part of a longer term, quite ambitious aim for these students, and this lesson helped to orient them more to these challenges. So recognising that the lesson was challenging, the students were stretched individually and, more importantly, collectively. And this observer noticed that a community of practice had been discussed in lesson one and had been established for this lesson too. So they agreed with observer one that there were times when the students were very challenged and that making the lesson easier might seem the answer. However, how far to challenge these students is also a question of gauging their communal zone development. That's going back to Vygotsky. And in stretching the most able while providing structured group activities to support the less able. I felt the tasks were indeed able to meet these different needs. So what I want us to see is that these two observers, while ostensibly focusing on the same aspect of the lesson, had very different views about it. And I'm going to show you some pairs of statements which come from a paper on teacher beliefs that I wrote. It was published in 2012. And we just want to think a little bit about what the underlying views were. So you can see 1 and 2, the student should be challenged with new and unfamiliar material and difficult tasks, or the student should not be challenged with material and tasks which might be too difficult for them. And then the other pair, students should practice reading, writing, listening and speaking at their level of competence, or students should be supported to read, write, listen and speak beyond their level of competence. And these beliefs were drawn from discussions I had with teachers who were teaching the lower level of Access EAP Foundations, the course book. And so these were views that were coming out of the data for the research project, and you can see the reference there. So I just want to think, well, what are the underlying views? There's some statements which we could say were their views. So we're now getting towards a thinking about teaching and developing this idea of metacognition. What are their theories of teaching? Well, basically got two theories of teaching. One's acquisition, acquiring the language structure and vocabulary. Another one's participation, which is the performance using the language structures. And so, but these are kind of separate theories, and of course we need them both. But what we might see is that the acquisition theory is the one which says teach at the current level and make sure students can function at the current level. And I would say that's probably suitable for lower levels. And the purpose for using language there is to build a repertoire of vocabulary and grammar structures, whereas participation, in my view, and you can disagree with me, of course you can, I think participation is suitable for the kinds of levels we're teaching, because we want our students to join their disciplinary communities of practice. So we challenge them, but we scaffold the performance beyond the current level that they're at to stretch them, and they are using the language to join their community. We haven't got time. We haven't got time to teach at the level because we just never get them to the level we need them to be. So we sort of have to stretch them. But as Observer 2 said, we have to have a little community of practice in the class that supports them to be able to do that. So this is what I mean when I say, what's your underlying theory of teaching? What's your approach? And that's going to be important when we come to doing the task. So I'm now going to tell you a little bit about the task. We're going to be able to allow about 30 minutes for this, and I really do strongly suggest you do the task. I know in these workshops it's sometimes really pleasant just to get in a group, chat away, ask people where they're from. You'll want to do all that, of course, but not for the whole 30 minutes. And I think it's really a valuable thing to think about doing, to try to experience the task and then have something to say about what you've learned from that experience. So this is actually based on a paper from 1998, Self-Development Through Classroom Observation, by two teachers, Wang and Seth, who were teaching in China. And at that time, and subsequently, I think, observation was a really scary thing in China. Huge numbers of very high-level people could walk into your classroom at a moment's notice and watch you teach. It must have been really difficult, I think, to think about that. And what Wang and Seth wanted to do was to encourage teachers to think about observation not in that really scary way, but in a way that was developmental and which might help them to deal with the other way. So as I said, Maxine Gildway gave me the combined observation, and that's what we're going to use for this particular workshop. So you're going to need to describe a recent teachable moment in your class. At least one of the people in the workshop will need to do that. And this idea of teachable moments comes out of the research that I've been doing with Sue and Judith recently. So a teachable moment is one of those instances which might be planned, it might be spontaneous, when the flow of your lesson is interrupted to address specific student needs. A student might ask a question, you divert to answer it. You might discover that your students could just do with a little bit of a reminder about something that's going to form the basis of the lesson that you're teaching. But you go off at a bit of a tangent, and it introduces this moment of uncertainty. The lesson moves in an unexpected direction. So this is really by way of saying we don't want the speaker, the person who's going to describe their lesson, to describe the whole lesson. This is a way of getting you just to focus on a teachable moment. And so while we're setting up the breakout rooms, which is going to happen in just a minute, you can be thinking back about things you've taught and whether you can select one of these moments in your class. And they'll be memorable. You'll probably be able to remember them from years ago, because they're the sort of things that they do introduce uncertainty, and they're sorts of things you can remember. So that's going to be the basis for the observation, for the description of what happened when the observer's not there. So for the task, you're going to be in breakout rooms of 3, groups of 3 in the breakout rooms, and you have 30 minutes for the task. And so there's 3 roles: a speaker, an understander, and an observer. And if you find that you manage to get through one teachable moment, then obviously you can switch around and change roles. But the speaker is effectively the teacher, describing a recent teachable moment in their classroom. And then Wang and Seth had this nice idea of the understander is the person who just interacts with the speaker without any judgment at all, doesn't make any judgment statements, and just tries to support the reflection on what happened. And what that'll mean is just asking the kind of questions which help the speaker to go more deeply into what was happening. So what did you decide to do next? And what did you think about that? Those are the questions that the understander is probably using to try to think about what this teachable moment was, what the experience was like. And then the third person is the observer, and they're not going to speak. So the observer is going to watch the speaker and the understander, listen to them, have their interaction, and try to just take some notes to enable the interpretation of the underlying view of teaching. And that's really what kind of thing was happening here. So then once the speaker has finished describing their teachable moment and the understander and speaker interacted around it to understand it more clearly, then all three of the participants can then discuss what they've learned, and it's the observer that's going to have the opportunity to give the feedback. So the observer is going to be the one who speaks when we come back to the plenary session. So it's really important that the speaker, the understander, and the observer discuss together what's going to happen, so that the observer knows that what they say will be what everybody's agreed they're going to say. Okay, so speaker describes the teachable moment, understander interacts to try and reflect, help the speaker to reflect on what happens. Observer doesn't speak while the interaction is going on, but takes notes to try to support an interpretation of this view of teaching. So when we come back to the when we come back into the plenary session, obviously we have around about, what have we got? We've got about 86 participants. So not every group is going to have a chance to give feedback, and we're going to set up the Padlet to enable some of the feedback to go on there. But there will be a chance for some of the observers to speak, to say what sort of thing they saw, but we'll keep you to strict time. So there would just be time to give a very quick feedback on the kinds of things you learned from doing this, and the sorts of things that we'll be asking about were, what have you learned about your approaches of theories of language or learning or teaching? If you do feel anxious about observations, did this experience reduce your anxiety at all, and in what ways? And then another chance to write 2 or 3 words to capture your feeling about observation. Okay, so that's, I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint now. I have given you a little handout which contains the instructions and contains some of the texts that I've been using, and I'm going to hand over to Carol now to put you into the breakout rooms.